Oakley dokley, everybody, thank you so much. Hey, all you cats and kittens out there, thanks for dealing with our technical issues that we seem to be suffering from. I'm Adam Kempenek. You might recognize me from the Hubitat community, sporting a nice little bow tie. Who do we have live over the phone today? Tony, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, this is Tony Smith. I'm out of Fargo, North Dakota. Adam and I went to college together. Though he and I went and coded together in the college days, am a novice, and we'll kind of just be talking back and forth with Adam as we go.
Yeah. Basically, Tony and I went to college together. I'm very grateful to have him here with us live. He'll be fielding any questions. If you have questions, I would absolutely love to have you push them out into the chat. Tony can put them on the screen, and we'll be able to answer them as as they come up. So, Tony, why don't you put up our fun little geezers graphic? I want to start with something that is a little more lighthearted, because during the thread that was in the Habitat forum, we had it kind of get hijacked. Will you give me the geezers graphic, Tony?
I did just put that live, yeah.
That's the coding one, the one that says.
I'm sorry, you're
That's all
right.
right.
They look
Yeah,
exactly the
no, we're,
same. Okay, there we go. My
yeah,
bad.
they look exactly the same, except one of them says something for the geezers. So, Ashok, you brought this up yesterday, and a few people uh, had started going off about DOS prompts and how these old systems used to have to type into a command interface. And I was actually, at the recommendation of Steph Hack, requested to have the first tutorial be coding on a Commodore 64 basic prompt, a simple hello world. So I've got that ready here, and I'm just emulating this online, which is super cool to be able to emulate it. Um, so we'll put in line 10, print, hello world. And the character set's a little different on here because on my keyboard it's a US map, but the character encoding is different. So I have to hit Shift and 2 to get quotations, which is different from using the usual Shift and then the apostrophe key, which is right next to the return key. So
Is that a Commodore 64 thing, or is that an emulation thing?
I'm not sure. I didn't check the character set. I just basically hit every key on the keyboard to figure out what it took to get a quotation.
Wise geezers in the chat, enlighten us if you can.
Why is geezers in the chat? I think it goes back to a time when Bruce or Chuck, somebody on the forums, relabeled a thread to say it was banter that these geezers had, and it was kind of a lighthearted comment, and he essentially took it, relabeled it, put it into a different section of the forum under the lounge, I think, because it got so far off topic. And I think it was actually about command prompts again, so that's kind of funny that it came full circle to that. So 10 print hello world, 20 end. Let's run that. Hello world. That's our first tutorial of the day. Thanks to Steph Hack for recommending that. That is something for the geezers. Now, let's get to the actual show today. We have a few very, very basic things. Basically, today I want to go over how to write an app from the ground up, how to write a driver from the ground up, and then we're going to turn that into a more full-fledged weather API. I want to take this all from a very, very basic standpoint. I'm not actually a developer by trade, which is kind of interesting. How do you describe what I do, Tony?
Technically, your position title is maker, I know. Basically, you work for a commercial production company, high-end commercial production company. You work with really nice equipment and do really high-quality work, but you just kind of tinker and do all the little things that they need done, whether it's technical, whether it's set design, whether it's video production, and you just kind of do it all and wear a lot of hats, I know.
Yeah, so I actually work at a company called Threefold. We're a commercial film production company based out of Bismarck, North Dakota, the heart of everywhere in the state. So we do a lot of traveling, do a lot of work around the state, around the U.S., and not so much traveling right now, obviously, with the current world situation. But yeah, so I'm not actually a developer by trade. So if you see me doing something that might not be by the book, I don't have a formal background. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them as best as I can. And I would love again to hear if you have any questions. So we're going to get started out by actually, I want to give an update on something. I had said that I can do 3D prints. Tony had mentioned that I do 3D printing, and I our printer is actually offline. So if anybody had requested any 3D prints on the forums, I wasn't able to get those out. The printer will be fixed Tuesday, and I'll be able to ship those out to you. So I just wanted to give a quick update on that.
Adam, quick thing from the chat. My volume is a lot higher than yours, apparently. If you wouldn't mind rebalancing that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Let me pull you down here. And
Thank you, Wing.
yeah, thank you for pointing that out. And again, anything else that you notice here, I would love to make a point to get that fixed up. Thank you also for dealing with our technical difficulties, as this is our first stream. So, all right, what do you say we get started?
We're definitely experimenting here. We've got Discord chat feeding my audio. We've got your audio locally there. I'm remoted into your graphics computer, switching your graphics, but you're also running your own switching board for video.
Yeah, it's a little different when you can't be in the same room because of quarantine. It makes it a little bit more difficult.
It sounded like God speaking to Noah.
All right. Yeah, so let's get started. Basically, I'm on my home development hub here, and I want to start with just writing a basic primer app. And so I like to start every app by writing in the comments above, which is slash and 2 asterisks, what the app's purpose is. This will be primer app. And
so
basically,
I'm a novice when it comes to Hubitat.
Go ahead.
I bought a Hubitat on sale at your direction. So this is just native in any Hubitat, right? You can just code whatever you want.
Yeah. So basically, and we'll just go from the top here, on any hub, you greet it with your home screen. And on the left, you have your devices, apps, and settings. And then under advanced, you have the option for apps code or drivers code. As an example, I've written a Lightify bridge gateway. So that's not something that is included with the hub. It's not something that the Hubitat team maintains. This is code that you will add onto your side of it, and it'll allow you to expand your hub to do things that aren't included out of the box. So you can also, as an example here, I've got a Magic Home light, and actually you can see it behind me right here. That is not something that is included with the hub. It's something that you install the code, and then you can use these lights with the hub, but it's not maintained by the developers themselves. It's maintained by the community. In this case, it's an app or a driver that I've written. So it allows you to expand it. Now, writing something like an app would be useful if you wanted to, well, as an example, integrate a Lightify bridge. This app can communicate with the bridge itself and then go back and forth and communicate with the devices from the bridge. Or, as we'll see later, you could communicate with a weather integration. So we're going to, like I said, go over and write an integration for world weather, because Brian from the community has already written a weather.gov implementation. So I'm not going to tread over his work there. I changed my pace to work on a world weather integration. And at the end of the day, it'll probably be a pull request to merge with his code base. So let's get started writing a basic app. Basically, I want to write an app that will listen to a switch turning on or off, and then it will mirror that to another switch. So I'll create a virtual switch, and when I toggle that switch, it'll mirror its state to this device that's behind me, this bulb. So let's get writing that. Again, I like to, you click on apps, and you click on new app. I like to put a description at the top of what the app will do. So this will be a primer app.
And stupid question, what language is this?
This is Groovy, so it's Java-like and based off of Java from my understanding. but it is a little different. It's a little easier to write in than Java. So this app
So if
listens.
I remember my intro to computer science class, I should be pretty comfortable and familiar with
Oh,
this.
totally. Yeah. Yep.
I don't remember any of that, so I won't be, but just kind of clarifying that.
Yeah. No, that's and Google is your friend with all of this. You'll see that I don't have a lot of this memorized. Um, and so a great resource that you can go to is actually, funny enough, the Smart Things developer documentation. Um, and I Google that every time I need to find it. Smart Things documentation, and you'll see the classic documentation right here because Habitat and Smart Things actually very closely mirror each other as far as architecture goes. So, Tony, it seems like you're a little quiet now. And somebody says you're like.
Sounds like it.
There, I'll pull
Boost
you
me
up a
up
little
just
bit.
a tad. Somewhere in the middle. We got to Goldilocks it.
That's our friend Tony, and he likes to whisper.
All right, so hopefully it's better now. Let's see. All right. So let's go back to the Smart Things developer documentation. And you can see there's getting started section. They even have a writing your own smart app ready to dive in. You can follow that tutorial, which is basically what we're doing now. But if you have any questions about what you can do, what the limitations are of what you can do, this is a great place to look at. There's also the Hubitat documentation. Tony, do you want to put up the lower third with the Hubitat documentation link?
Yeah.
That's docs.hubitat.com. And those, everything that you can do
here we go.
is on this page. So let's see. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, you have developer documentation, and this again shows you what you can do. But going between the Smart Things developer documentation and the Hubitat documentation will get you pretty much everything that you need to do to start an app. So I will go into the Smart App section here, and basically I want to look at getting started with an app. So let's actually take a look at the anatomy here. So it breaks down pretty well how an app is structured. So you have your metadata. This just defines what the app is all about. You have your preferences. This is where, as a user, you can go and change your settings. You can say, when this switch turns on, I want to do this. And basically that looks at a list of capabilities, and it lets you change what devices you're selecting or what attributes you're selecting. And then below that you have all of your app methods that handle basically everything that happens. So you pretty much always want to have installed, updated, and initialize. Those are all called at different times. So every time you install the app, it'll run this. And when you update the app, when you hit done in the settings, it'll run this. And then
Looks almost easier to set up methods than it was in Java. So
oh yeah, totally, because you can simply declare them. And I don't know if this is for certain, but I think that each app essentially acts as a class of its own. But I don't actually have any confirmation on that. So I'm going to start. We're just going to basically write up this definition section. So we start with definition and open parenthesis. We're going to give it a name. This would be our primer app. Namespace, which is just where the app's name operates. So we're going to call this demonstration. And we've got the author of the app, in this case, it's me. And a description. Let's write an app. And then under category, in this case, and again, this entire list is available under the Smart Things documentation, and there's also a list under the Hubitat documentation, if I'm not mistaken. Our category would be convenience. And, include a comma. We have icon URLs, which Hubitat doesn't use, SmartThings does. I'm going to leave these blank. Icon x2 URL. Then you have an x3 URL. We'll leave those blank. And wrap our parentheses out. Yep, that matches. And then we've got our device settings, excuse me. So we'll give it a preferences page. Preferences, okay, I spelled that correctly. We'll open the brace here. And so I'm going to declare a page, essentially. I'm going to say, when the preferences load, I want to look at this dynamic page, which will be defined later. But the page that I'm going to load is called child. Oh, I don't want to call it child setup. I'm so used to writing parent and child devices that excuse me, by default just called it child device. So we're actually going to call it setup. And that'll be our child device method that it'll look for the preferences page. So we can close out of preferences. So we've closed out of definition and our preferences. We're good there. And right away, I'm going to define that setup method that we talked about so that it knows where to look for the preferences. So def setup. No parameters will be passed through to that. And essentially, I'm going to call this a dynamic page. I could just do a very basic page. SmartThings actually does that in their documentation. I'm not going to do it here. I think it is better to just get started with a dynamic page. You don't have to add more pages, but this is a good way to have a foundation set up so that if you want to start adding more pages later, you already have the groundwork done. You can add more methods, you can add more pages, and you don't have to worry about changing the whole infrastructure of your app. So I'm going to write it with dynamic pages, just getting started out here, and I think that'll be easier for people to maintain going on. And you can actually find the documentation here at the link right here, docs.hubitat.com. If you scroll all the way to the bottom, you'll see developer documentation. You can click on that, and that'll show you the list of other things. The other page you can go to is docs.smartthings.com, and that will have all of the documentation for SmartThings, so you can kind of work back and forth and fill in the gaps in the documentation where need be. So let's get back to the app here. We're calling our setup method, and I'm going to write a dynamic page.
So is setup like main in Groovy World?
Not really. Maybe. Man, if I were to say what main would be like in this, it would probably be installed, because that's the first thing that's called when an app is installed, and that'll call dependencies. So essentially, every time that you load an app, it'll either run installed or it'll run updated if you just hit saved in your preferences. So either one of those two might be more like main if you were to draw a direct comparison there, just because that's the top-down hierarchy that it'll call from. So we've got our dynamic page. I'm going to give it a name. I'll call it, I almost called it child setup again. So I'm just going to call it setup. Title, give it a title that it'll display on the top of the page. Primer app. Close out that. Next page. Null. So I'm actually going to put all this code on GitHub too. So anybody who wants to use it, you can go to my GitHub, which is, if you search for Adam Kempenek, you'll find it. And I'll post it to the live link for this stream as well in the Hubitat forums. And so essentially I just declared that this is the page that's shown when you install it, and when you can also uninstall the app from this page, so it'll have a remove button in the corner. And then refresh interval. I don't know if this one is declared with a default value or not, but a refresh interval will be 0 just in case it is not declared by default. All right, so we've got a page written, and under each page we are going to have different sections. So in this case, I'm just going to declare a section. You can put a title in this section, and it'll display it. And under that, you can have your separate inputs. So I'm going to have a trigger switch, and then I'm going to have an output switch that it'll essentially turn on and off every time that this gets called. So that's the basic setup. We're going to have a switch that, when we turn it on and off, will mirror the output to another device. So our input switch is going to be trigger switch, is what I'm going to call it.
So what's the practical application for something this simple, Adam? If I were to start home automating my tiny efficiency apartment, what would I be able to do this with? Or what would be the practical application of this?
That's a great question, Tony. So a good example of that would be if you have, let's say, a contact sensor. And if you wanted to write an app where you open, say, a closet door, and you want to have a light that will turn on, you could very easily modify this code, and it could say, instead of capability.switch, you could say capability.contact. And then if your contact switches to open, you want a light to turn on. And if it switches to close, then you'd want the light to turn off. So essentially, this app can be used to very quickly write your own app to change the behavior of different devices if you don't want to use Rule Machine.
And if you don't want to use the pre-canned stuff that's built into Hubitat.
Yeah, exactly. And Rule Machine is great, but it might sometimes be easier or cleaner to write your own applications, and maybe you'll even get a speed boost out of that. But Rule Machine is very advanced, but this is very advanced because you can make way more use cases and get it as specific as you want. So a good example would be is that I want an app that would do contact and motion lighting out of the box. In Hubitat, you only get motion lighting. So that would be something where I'd be able to write my own app and very quickly change it without having to make a bunch of rules that can get messy really quickly and become kind of hard to manage. So that's a more specific use case. Yep. And I wanted to go down to the capability list. This is under docs.hubitat.com. And if you click on developer documentation, it's all the way at the bottom. I'm going to look for switch. So this is where you see capability.switch, and it'll show you what our responses are going to be for if you turn a device on or off. It'll let you see exactly what you're looking for and what the device will respond with when you do that. So let's see. So yeah, I'm going to be looking for our input, and I want it to be capability.switch. Again, I pulled that from the Hubitat driver capabilities list, and you can also find that under the Smart Things list. I like to find it under the Hubitat side. Oh no, I just closed the tab. I'm going to have to start over, aren't I? Yes, I will. That's embarrassing. Primer app. Well, yeah, so does anybody have any questions right now? I'd be happy to take a look at them as I rewrite this. What do you thinking?
I haven't gotten a ton.
Tony, I remember a story about Joseph Latimer, one of our college professors. And we've been out of college for, oh man, years now. But what did he have to say about DOS and Unix? That's kind of a funny thing.
So he's an old school Windows guy, but he said in college he was always friends with old school Linux guy, or Unix guys, I should say. And he said he outlived them all, so that was proof that DOS was the superior operating system in those days, or that Windows is the superior operating system. Not sure what his logic on that was, but if you can just imagine a really old Southern grandpa who was also really good at computer science, that's who Joseph Latimer was.
Joseph, if you're for some reason tuned into our stream today, you did teach us a lot, and I guess he did outlive everybody, which is...
He was one of my favorite computer science instructors. He took things very... he was very easygoing. You could definitely tell he was getting ready to retire, or that he just didn't really care to retire ever, and that they weren't going to ever kick him out. Because he was just like... Let's see, the video from your monitor is unreadable in my system.
Too small, maybe? Here, we'll make it bigger.
Yeah, very blurry. I'm guessing when the final version gets uploaded, it'll be a lot higher quality, but yeah, while we're going live, it's probably not going to be as high quality.
Yeah. So maybe, and I just got a notification that somebody unlocked the front door, so I want to say it. You might hear some barking in the background. We have a few spunky dogs, and I'm
Those
obviously...
Shibas.
They're Shiba Inus. They're very spunky, and they're from Nebraska. So they're Nebraskan dogs. I'm just basically going through and undoing the mistake that I made when I closed out that. I wanted to close this tab, actually. So we're giving it a title again. This will be Primer App. And next page. No. Install true. Uninstall true. Refresh. Interval 0. And this will be our settings page. So we have our section. And we'll just give it a section 1, which is probably better than the hello that I had thrown in there earlier. And that's essentially just going to display at the top of the page. I'm going to add a few extra lines so we're not at the bottom. Yeah, so now I'm going to redeclare that input. So we're going to have input, trigger, switch, capability, dot switch. And if I'm not mistaken, yeah, down later on below, you can essentially, when you're calling this, say, well, I only want to call this when the switch turns on, or I only want to call it when the switch turns off. But we'll declare that later. Title, which switch will trigger other lights. And I only want one switch to appear in this list. So I'm going to say multiple false and required true. So you won't be able to save the app, or you won't be able to save the settings until this is called, or until it's set up properly. So that's our trigger switch. We've got that all configured. I'm going to do the same thing with our action switch. Again, we want to have a setup where we can call it trigger, and then we want to have it actuate actually other devices. So that's basically what we're setting up right now. So we've got our trigger switch set up, and now we're calling an action switch. And again, this will be devices that have the capability switch. You can find those capabilities on the Hubitat documents page. And our title. So essentially we're doing the same thing up here, but we're just going to handle the devices differently down below when we actually write our methods. So our input action, switch, and mirror the behavior from above to these devices. So I'm going to do something different this time. I'm going to have multiple devices true, because I want to be able to say select more than one device. And then required true, because this app wouldn't do much. Oh, look at me. There we go. Messed up our input. Can everybody see it a little bit better now? Looks like it's better.
General feedback from the chat is that yes, it's a lot better now.
Perfect. All right. Sorry about the hiccup with that then. I'm used to... I set all of my normal screens to be really small because then you can just see everything at once. So thank you for letting me know. And we have our input set up now. So something else that's really cool is that you can actually change the title of an app pretty easily. You just put label title, and this will let you change the name of this app, so you could call it whatever you want. You don't have to leave it called Primer app. This is useful for if you have like 5 or 6 apps that do the same thing. Normally you'd use like a child app, but this would let you have multiple apps and essentially relabel them to be different for each app. So you could have one that says toggle upstairs lights when this switch turns on, or you could say turn on the library light when this virtual switch turns on. So that just lets you change it organizationally. It won't actually have an input or an effect on the app itself. It's just for your own organization. So we have our section closed out here. We're going to close out our page, and then we're going to close out this method. And now I'm going to essentially call for installed. Oh, better define it first. So I'm going to call installed, no parameters with installed. I'm going to put this to the logs because I want to essentially know when something comes through. So this is log debug installed application. We're going to unsubscribe from any events that this is already subscribed to. So essentially, where you see input trigger and input action switch, we're going to subscribe to events so that when something happens to those, the app knows, oh, I should listen for this, and then I should do something with this. When we say unsubscribe, it tells the app to stop listening for that, and it will ignore events from that point on, which will clean it up because we're about to redeclare it. So when we install it, we're going to unsubscribe, we're going to unschedule, and then we're going to call our initialize method. Basically,
and then Adam, just to clear something up that came up in the chat, it sounds like the answer is yes, you're going to, but you're going to throw this up on GitHub, right?
Absolutely, yes. All of this, both the primer app and the primer driver, will be available on GitHub after we're done. For our installed method, I basically want the updated method to do the same thing. I want to start ignoring everything. Sometimes it's wise to put this right into your initialization method, but right now we're not going to do that.
So when I think installed, when I'm looking at methods or things like that, I'm thinking like an actual installer. That's not what this is when we're talking about Hubitat, right?
Nope, install is when you go to your apps page and you go to the little plus button that says add user app. It'll show up here, and when you click on it, it'll call the installed method when you finish going through that first page.
So, and this is just me being nitpicky or me being, a novice with computer science. Why is it installed and not install? When I think about computer science, I've always been told with methods they should be action words. So why is it not install to complete that method, and why is it installed with ed at the end?
You know, I don't have a definitive answer on that. I think that's a good question. I would presume that it's called installed because it's called after the installation runs, after you go through the initial setup of the app itself and click done. That would be my guess, but I think that might just honestly go back to the SmartThings legacy, just how they decided to call it, because this is, again, based off of the SmartThings development documentation.
Gotcha.
So we've
so old leftovers from Samsung's days. Kinda.
Yep.
Okay.
And that's these are obviously very interchangeable between SmartThings and Hubitat as far as methods and everything goes, because they're both based off of Groovy. So essentially, I'm gonna log an info. You noticed earlier I wrote log.debug. Right here, I'm writing log.info. There are several different levels. There's log.trace, .error, .info, .debug, and there's one more that is not coming to me off the top of my head. But I want to call this just as a general information point. I'm going to say that it's initializing with settings. And something cool is that you can inject variables, or you can do code inside of your strings in Groovy. So that's what this $ and then open bracket here calls. And I'm going to just put our entire settings into it from above. So it's actually going to write to the log, it'll say initializing the settings, and then it'll show which settings we've selected. And that'll write to the logs. And then I'm going to subscribe. Oh boy. So earlier I said that you can subscribe to devices. I'm going to subscribe to our trigger switch. And here's where you can write switch. And you can say, I want to call switches when they turn on, or I want to call switches when they turn off. Or in this case, I just want to call switches when they turn on or off. And when they do turn on or off, I want to call this handler. So I'm going to call it event handler, which will just
So another novice question for you, Adam. Subscribe is basically saying, hey, listen to this device, and unsubscribe is saying, hey, stop listening to this device. You don't care about it anymore.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so unsubscribe, if I were to say unsubscribe now, it would stop listening for anything that we have called here. And right now it's going to take all of the devices that we have assigned in our settings. It'll say when the switch event happens, call event handler. So that's actually all we need to do for initialize. And now we can get on to writing event handler. Ooh.
You know what I already like about Groovy that I'm noticing that's different from Java?
What's
the
that?
lack of semicolons.
Yes,
There's nothing like hunting down that missing semicolon.
So people watching might have noticed I like to, every time I write a method, make sure that I have closed everything up properly. In this case, I forgot to add the other end parenthesis here, and I noticed that this was red, meaning that it couldn't find a matching bracket, or is that a brace? But when I found out what I was missing, it turned back green, and I know, okay, that method's closed up, so I can go on to the next one. And this event will actually be our event handler, which we called right here. So we want event handler. We're going to call EVT will be what it's going to call. So anything that's passed through to this will be declared in this variable, which is called EVT. And we're going to log this into our debugs. And we're going to say switch was turned. We're going to call some code, evt.value. This is just from experience, I know to call evt.value. But it'll essentially take the value of whatever is passed through to our event handler, and it'll log that. If we were to just log event, it would just literally log the event name, so we don't want to do that. So we're going to say if event.value equals on, then for each device in our action switch, the settings.action switch, so we've essentially just gone through the array of all of our switches, and we've said for each time, or for each different device, we're going to run this. So we're going to say device.on, and that'll run the on method for the device. And if we don't receive an on command, I should close that up. There we go. I want to do the same thing, but I want to turn the device off. So we've wrapped that, and now we can actually wrap our event handler method. I'm going to save this. I did that too quickly and called them both the same thing. But essentially we just saved it, and now we can go and use this app. So before we do that, I'm going to open our logs, and I'm going to put that side by side, so we'll be able to see the logs live as they come through and as we install this app. So I've saved that app code, and I am now going to add a user app. I better refresh this page. Add a user app, a primer app. Look at that. That's perfect. An unexpected error, and this is great. I'm actually glad that I definitely typed something wrong in there. So it says, no signature of method, user app demonstration, primer app 91.setup is available for argument. And setup might actually be taken, so we might have to call it app setup. And that might be issue that we were facing.
So now you get to have the fun of looking through your code.
Exactly.
Can't make it look too easy.
Yep, and now we've just got a general error. All right. An unexpected error. So I definitely did something silly. So let's see. No signature of method app is available for. Oh, okay. Okay. So it doesn't like that I'm not calling parameters somewhere, it looks like. Well, that's great. So I was calling for setup, and I did it out of habit again. I called it child setup. Really, I should have called it app setup. So it was confused as can be, looking for a page that didn't exist. And now that we fixed it, I'm going to go back, add a user app, primer app, fingers crossed. There it is. So this primer app is the app
Brian
title.
wants to know, is child setup function that needs to be controlled? Is it the function that needs to be called?
It would be the one that needs to be called. Yeah, I mislabeled it. I should have called it app setup because that's what I had declared. Or originally I just called it setup, and basically you saw the debug process of what I went through to go through my method of figuring out what I needed to debug. So we have our primer app. That's the app's name. That's what we are declaring in the dynamic page's title. We see section 1 as we're declaring our section. That's seen right here. And we have our input and our output, which we declared right here. So our input, our trigger switch, and our action switch. So I'm going to actually, so we're going to start over. Make a new primer app. Okay. So I only have this light that's behind me. This is the upstairs live. I actually have to go and create a virtual switch that we can use as a trigger. So we're going to go into devices. Just for this example, I'm going to add a virtual device. I'm going to call it trigger switch. Type will be virtual switch. I'm going to hit save. So this is our trigger switch. You can just turn it on or off. And I'm going to go back into our apps. I'm going to add our app again, primer app. And now we have our trigger switch as a switch that can trigger other lights, and I'm going to mirror the behavior to my piano light, which is right here. I'm going to hit
Adam,
done.
I think we're having a little bit of trouble with the stream. I was losing some connectivity. I thought it was because my girlfriend was streaming something herself, but it looks like Wing is saying that we're having a little bit of trouble with the stream as well.
Okay.
Can you take a look at the encoding?
Yeah, certainly. It's not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming. Okay. Well, let's actually, YouTube isn't going to let me change that right now. For the parts that are a little jittery, after the stream is uploaded, or after it's over, I will make sure that it's re-uploaded, and it should play back smoothly then, just because I do have a recording of it, and hopefully it comes back smoothly. I'm sorry for all the stuttering that we've been experiencing. I'll make sure that we get it faxed out for episode 2 here.
We're getting mixed results, and I do happen to know my bandwidth is being cut right now, so
Okay.
we might just be dealing with some people hogging some internet.
Yeah, I mean, it could also be, I'm sure that everybody right about now in our city is trying to start watching their stream, so maybe it's on my end as well. I would not doubt that at all. Again, sorry for the streaming interruptions. If you have been experiencing that, I will upload this after it's done, and we'll be able to watch it with smooth playback then. So we've got our primer app written, and I went and I hit save. And then that's where it ran that installed method, Tony, so labeled something improperly. And that would be right here where I only put setting and not settings because I was feeling a little goofy. So if we call that, there we go, no error. Always double check what you write. And now if we call this, it'll turn the switch on and off. So I'm going to give you a live demonstration of that right here. I'm hitting on, and that's going through the app and turning it on. And then if we hit off, it'll turn it off. So I'm going to actually switch to V1 here. I'm going to change our V1 background. Bear with me as I get this set up so that you can all see it. There we go. So I'm going to hit on, and you can see it come on behind me. I'll hit off, and it turns off.
Can't hear that nice screech from Adam's class.
From my desk? Whoops.
Yes.
Whoops-a-daisy. So that's a basic app, and that's about as simple as you can get. It's just saying, hey, listen for this event, and then it calls a different action when it listens for that event. Again, I will upload this to GitHub, and we'll be able to use that to write more apps. So essentially, you can look through the documentation, and you can try different subscriptions. You could subscribe to a contact switch, or say a temperature, and you could say, well, when the temperature reaches, 86 or whatever, then I want to turn on the air conditioning because 86 Fahrenheit would be very warm, and 86 centigrade would be even worse. You'd be dang near boiling alive, and obviously at that point you'd want some air conditioning. I think you would at least. So we've written the primer app, and now let's do the same thing with a driver. I'm going to close our logs here, and I've got all of my. This is my development hub again, so you can see that I was working on Lightify lately. A device or a driver is going to be pretty much the same as far as metadata goes. There's a little bit of different terminology that you have to use, a little bit of a different structure with a primer or with a device driver. So I'm going to call this primer device. And again, we're going to go metadata. We're going to say definition. And a good way to make sure you get this right is Hubitat has a really sweet GitHub repository, and it actually has a bunch of example drivers, and it's got a few, and they're a little bit more advanced, but it's got a few example drivers, and I think there might even be an app or two in there too that you can take a look at. Otherwise, different community repositories, BPT World, Brian has a really great repository that makes it super easy to learn from. Just make sure that you follow code attribution if you are borrowing people's code. It's not fun to steal people's work. So we're going to name this a primer device type. Namespace again. This will just be development. Author. That's me. Import URL, which is something that I like to put in here. So this is if you have something from GitHub, you can pull an import URL, and you can hit this import button, and it'll actually pull the code live from GitHub, and it'll essentially give you an easy update option for people that are using your code base. So when I say to people, you can go ahead and update your Magic Home driver, essentially what I'm telling them to do is go into this driver and hit the import button, and then hit save or done, and it'll save your code from the latest push that I made to GitHub. There's also like a documentation URL, and I think a video URL as well. Those have been added as far as, I think it was 2.19, the Hubitat release, that added those two. But I'm not 100% sure. So if you have like a video, you can also add that in as a demonstration, or documentation. They'll appear in the corner of an app or a device so that people can more easily take a look at that and get help. So something that we do with devices is essentially we have to tell the hub, well, here's what this device can do. So our device is going to have an actuation or an actuator. saying that, this is something that can be physically toggled or changed. Capability, this will be initialize. We want it to have...
So is actuator a general term, or is that more of a specific term to this device?
That's more of a general term. And if we go to the driver capability list, we can click on actuator. And we can see that in order to change things, I'm pretty sure we have to have actuator in there. But it essentially just says that these settings can be changed. So we put that in there. And some devices will have a refresh capability. I'm going to put it in here as an example. But I'm going to have capability switch. And that's the money one. This is essentially saying, hey, I'm a switch device type. I can do these following things, and that is available here. So if you were to have a dimmer, you'd include switch, and you'd also include switch level, and that level would be your brightness, essentially. So we'll go back to our app, and we'll close out our definition for our capabilities, and we'll close out our metadata. So we're going to do two things here. We're going to say, well, first we better do this. When we install the app, or we initialize it, we better have something to call. I did not spell that right. There we go. That looks better. So we're going to say log debug device initialize. We'll close that out, and then I'm going to comment do nothing, since nothing needs to be initialized. Sweet. We'll go to update it, just for when the device is updated, and essentially I just by default have this call initialize, so we're going to call initialize, but first device updated. So that'll be our action. All right, so now we essentially want to handle the switch. So the switch has on and off, and that will just call on and off methods for the device. So log debug device was turned on. And then we have to say, well, we need to tell the switch to update its attributes. So we're going to send event name switch. Oops, that is case sensitive, I believe. Value on. So when on is called, essentially when it receives a trigger, it'll run on, but then we need to actually tell the device to update its state. And so that's done manually there. And so we need to do the exact same thing for off. Device was turned off, send event, name, switch, value, off. All right, so now we've got it turning on and off. We can go ahead and save this, fingers crossed, no syntax errors. And we can go, I'm actually going to take our trigger switch that we had initialized, because essentially now this is acting the same way as a virtual switch would do. So we call that primer device type. I'm going to save it. I'm going to open our logs again. So our logs are empty. I'm going to turn the switch off, and it's behaving the exact same way as earlier. If I turn it on, the light behind me turns on, because it's still running through that app, and it's still telling the app that this switch is turning on and off. It's just doing it through our own device type now. And if we look at our logs, you can see that our device was turned on and off. One of them is coming through the app where it says switch was turned on and off. The other one is coming through the new driver that we wrote. So what if you wanted to, say, have the device toggle? You wanted to give it a custom toggle command.
Can I interrupt you for a second, Adam?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I got a question from chat. Other than the message, what is the difference between debug for example log?
Um,
Excuse me, I misspoke. Other than the message, what is the difference between debug and for example log?
and for example log, I'm actually going to go. Um, okay. Other than the messages, what is the difference between debug and for example log? I'm not sure I follow the question here. Yeah, would you mind rephrasing your question? I'm not sure I follow exactly what you're trying to ask there. I would love to ask that because logging is something that's very important. So I'd like to be able to get you a correct answer there as far as what you're asking goes. So Tony, let me
I'll
know
keep
when
an
that.
eye out for
Yeah.
his answer. Yeah,
Yes, please. When that gets
if you
updated,
want
let
to
me
keep
know.
going at him.
So what if we want to have like a toggle command in our switch? Well, we can go to driver capability list and we can say, well, does toggle exist in here? No, it doesn't. That's very sad. So we have to do it on our own. We'll go to our primary device type. We have capabilities up here, and there's a couple of things we can add into this definition section, and one of them is commands, which will be toggle. I'm going to make my own toggle command. So this is essentially just going to call a method with the name toggle, and I'm going to give it a capital T. So def toggle if device.current value switch. So this is looking at the device that we currently have open, and it's saying, hey, if the current value...
Adam, one real quick thing. Do you want to switch to your desktop display while you're typing?
Great call, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was the COVID cam.
Can you just go back to the spot you were typing? Just
Yeah.
do a real quick, hey, this is what I was talking about
Yeah,
here, this is what I was talking about here, just because
absolutely.
you did a little bit of typing while...
That was my my COVID cam. I wanted you all to make sure that it wasn't touching my face while I was coding. So
Everybody needs to see your face.
exactly.
I get it.
That's my focusing face. I was way too tunneled in here, and that's why we need a director. So essentially, I just in this definition section, I went in and I wrote command toggle, and then essentially this toggle or this command will call a method with this name, in this case toggle. And you can actually add stuff after this that will essentially pass a parameter through to the app. So let's find that in the SmartThings documentation. And we are looking for our definition section. So in the SmartThings definition, we can see what's all allowed in it. So this is something that's actually pretty useful to go and take a look at because it gives us the capabilities, which we've already listed. That's from that predefined list. And then this is what we're doing now, which is a command. And this will tell you that you can add custom parameters after that you can pass through to your driver. But right now, basically toggle will just turn the light on or off. So I've written that down here. I've defined toggle if the device is currently on. So this is saying, hey, this device, if the current value of it in the switch, which goes back to that enumerator where it's on or off, if that is on, then I want to call the device and turn it off. And otherwise, I'm going to call on because that means that the device is currently off. And I'm saying log.debug toggle called. And I can save this. If we go back into our trigger switch, you'll notice that there's a new command here called toggle. And according to this, I definitely typed something wrong again. This is why Double checking is so important because you can see that it is looking for a toggle capital T. This is case sensitive. That was my fault. Sorry, guys. So we'll call refresh here.
And Adam, once you get that fixed, now is a good time to switch back over to chat. There's been some back and forth on the last question that you had, and
Okay.
maybe throw in your 2 cents.
Sure. So I'll switch back over to chat here. All right. Some devices have 2 logging options, one being debug and the other one being description text, I think. Does it make a difference? Okay. Yes. So logging essentially doesn't do anything to the hub. The hub doesn't hold on to that. It purges those. I think it's every night when it runs maintenance. So when you log something, it actually stores it for, I think, 1,000 lines. It's not 1,000. It's a different amount, but it'll store it and then it'll purge it after a certain amount. But essentially, logging only displays to the logs, and it doesn't have any functionality impact, and it's very minimally resource intensive too. So it doesn't hurt to log things. Basically, this is just for a user to say, oh, here's what's going on with my hub right now. So it's useful for things like if you're writing an app and you want to follow the flow of it, or if you want to see when somebody turns on a light or turns it off. You can go back and use this essentially to say, here's what's happened on my hub. Aside from the question of going back and forth between description text logging and debug logging, a lot of times apps will have multiple options. Sometimes they'll even have more options that say error logging or like log down to this level. So I want to log everything, like errors only, and that's your very basic. Like if something goes horribly wrong, that's when we need to know because an app has crashed or if something didn't run properly. Like that's going to be the most basic level. And then as you work your way up, essentially description text and debug just are different levels of logging. So you'd have error logging, which would be the least amount of logging, just when something goes critically wrong. You'd have information logging, so like when somebody turns a switch on or when a switch turns off. And then you'd have debug logging, which would essentially say when a switch turns on or off, then these methods ran. And even above that, you could have trace logging, which would say when this switch turned on or off, these commands ran, this data was passed through to it, and this information was received from these devices. So essentially, it's just how much you want to put into the logs, how much you want to clutter them up, because they can get very busy very quickly. And so I'll actually quickly give an example of that. I'll actually go to my personal hub here on my house, and I don't have to log in. Sweet, it's already logged in. And we can just follow the flow of these logs, and you can see just how busy these can get really quickly. So within a couple of seconds here, we've already received 5 different logging events. And if you let this go, everything is going to check in really quickly, which isn't ideal. So most people will turn off logging. You can see there that everything just checked in. Most people will want to turn this off just because it doesn't help to see everything that's always happening on your hub, and it can make debugging really confusing. So they'll turn it off, but maybe they still want to see when a device is turning on or off, but they don't need to see that this device, just checked in. They can turn off the log debug setting, or they can just make it set as only logging information text. And that's something that you have to define itself. If you want a good example of that, feel free to take a look at my Magic Home drivers or even the Lightify drivers, which have that all built in. There's a method called log debug, and there's a setting called log debug. There's also a setting called log description text that you can take, and you can feel free to borrow the code from that, where it essentially checks if a user wants that stuff logged, and if they don't, it won't log it, but if they do, it'll throw it into there. So essentially, that's just going to...
Can you export that into a plain text document by chance?
Yeah,
just
sure.
For somebody like me who likes to have like Notepad++ or anything like that, is that exportable to a plain text doc?
Yeah, there's actually a couple of community integrations that have the ability to export that to like a separate server and then have it written to a file. Or you can just literally take that and copy and paste it. It's all raw HTML at the end of the day, so you can just copy and paste it. Yep. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so if you use like Sublime Text, or if you want to put it somewhere else and take a cleaner look at it, I'll actually pull it up because I've got a ton of stuff that I was working on a control panel here. So this is just what was coming through the logs for that. So that's absolutely something you can do. And this is a good example of all of the data that was being passed through when I was sniffing a Z-Bug or a Z-Wave device. So yeah, that's a great question. So the Tiger King memes there. So we just called our toggle method, and so this is like a user doesn't want to have to worry about, well, is that device on or off already? Um, well, don't have to worry about it. We can just go here and hit toggle, and it'll turn the light on if it's off. It'll turn it off if it's on. And we don't have to do a thing. We don't have to worry about what the current state is because it checks on that and then changes it. So that's a very, very basic device type. And it just turns a light on or off. But essentially, you could call from here. You could say, well, I need to turn a real device on. And so in the case of something like my Magic Home driver, I have to call a send data command, which essentially just sends things over telnet and socket, or TCP, excuse me, to tell a device that it needs to turn on or off. I should figure out what camera I'm looking at here. So yeah, that's a very basic device type, and essentially I want to turn this device type to pull weather from the International Weather Service. So I have, I think it's world weather, worldweather.wmo.int. Brian in the community, and I'll pull up the thread. I just saw this this morning because I wasn't on the community this morning, aside from posting that URL. Oh, wrong URL. But Brian, username at BPTWorld, has come to the rescue with this dark sky and Apple integration, and has taken a look, done some footwork to get the weather.gov integration working, and he has done some work on that already. So I'm not going to do weather.gov.
Adam, one quick question from the chat, just kind of a last clarification. So logs, information that you're happy to be purged quickly, and debug for debugging, and trace for something in between the two.
Yeah, so none of it will get saved, just to clarify that. It's only temporary, and if you don't have your logs open, then you can go back and look at them, but only up to a certain amount of lines. I don't know exactly what that number is. But essentially, trace, info, debug, error, they're just for your informational purposes, for being able to go through and see different types of debugging information. So I like to use trace, and actually this is something that SmartThings has declared in their documentation. Oops. So you can go to the SmartThings, you can see what they have to say about it, but basically their logging methods are just for different debug information that you want to see. Okay, so the one I was forgetting was warn. So you could say that in a runtime situation where something happens that's unexpected but not wrong, you should probably log that. But they have a good description of logging levels here and what they intended them to be used for. Really, you can use them for anything that you want, but none of this is permanent unless you are, say, exporting it to your own server. And there's a community integration for that again, I think, to be able to send that out to your server of your own. So that's the gist of logging. It's not permanent, very useful for looking back at things to see what went right, what went wrong, what do you need to change, what actually ran. And that's why, if you look on the forums themselves, Bruce and others have said, really all the tools that you need to see what's going right and what's going wrong to write an app are in there, just using this logging information. And I think it's 100% true, where you can see exactly what's failing. need more information than that really to see what's going wrong, because you can kind of debug it on your own just using the different logging information. But that's kind of a hot topic that a lot of people have brought up, and I wanted to kind of give some thoughts on it, where logging is very useful to know what's going wrong and then what's going right. So between that, you can kind of get everything working as need be. So yeah, were there any other questions that we wanted to answer right now? Yeah, Stephen, exactly. So no difference to the hub, just wait. Yep, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Just a different way to see the wood through the trees. I like that. That's a good description, and to create different levels. Exactly. So that'll give you different information. Yeah, so unless there's any other questions right now from the
One
live
just
audience.
came in. Would a poorly written app or driver possibly brick or crash your Hubitat?
That's a phenomenal question. Yes. Brick. Yeah, okay, so here's something with Rootin' Tootin' Self Rebootin', which is an app that essentially watches your hub and it says,
Isn't
hey,
that the one that you wrote?
yeah,
Self-plug?
yep, it watches if your hub has crashed or if it's slowing down, and if it detects it, it'll reboot it. So something that I did to a hub during development is that it essentially got it like stuck in an infinite cycle of rebooting. So in hub versions before, I think it's 2.19, they didn't limit how many events could handle every second, so you used to just bog down a hub, and like you'd really get it to go slow, and you couldn't interact with it at all. And then it was so slow that you couldn't access the back end of the hub to reboot it, or to reboot it into safe mode. So it's kind of a twofold question. A poorly written, I'm gonna change this here. A poorly written app could definitely crash your hub, but also, as of 2.19, it limits how much is happening. So it's a lot harder to do it now. Could you still do it? Probably. I've done it, certainly. But I don't think you could. I shouldn't say it. You probably could brick a hub, but you're usually able to get into that back-end interface and toggle it and reboot the hub without any apps or drivers running. And so you can then roll to a backup or just delete the problem driver or app. And you can do that by going to port 8081 on your hub and hitting safe mode, and it'll reboot it into safe mode. So in order to do that, you also need to know the MAC address of your hub, and basically that acts as confirmation that you should be rebooting your hub and that you have authorization to do so. If you do end up getting to a point where you have, say, a method that just keeps iterating and it keeps recursively breaking your hub, well, you're in luck, because thanks to limiting the hub amount of actions per second, and thanks to the backend menu, you can go and reboot your hub and hopefully save yourself from some trouble there. So now we're going to get into basically, like I was saying, Brian has a weather.gov integration that he's already started on, so I'm going to change it, and we're going to do something a little different. So instead of using weather.gov, I'm going to do world weather, which is worldweather.wmo.int, and then they actually have an API. So I'm going to go, I'm actually not going to close that. We'll close this one. World Weather API. And we'll see what their API looks like. And we want to find WMO. There we go. So they have a data guide. And I'm going to look at their data guide and say, well, how does it work? Basically, it pulls this URL. You have a city ID, and it'll give you a JSON file. So, well, we'll just try it with Bismarck, North Dakota. That's where this broadcast is happening from. That's where I live. Bismarck's a beautiful city, and right now it's covered with a beautiful 4 inches of snow that we got yesterday and the day before.
North
Right.
Dakota got its annual surprise winter.
Exactly. Yeah.
We always get winter, and then we have a few nice days where the snow wall melts, and we get close to spring, and then we always get surprise winter. So
Yeah, you're
that's what
exactly
we're in
right.
the middle of right now.
Yep. And it's just, oh man, it's crazy because like I had seeded our entire lawn. I had gone and cleaned up all of the brush that's outside, and suddenly, well, everything's white outside and it's just completely covered in snow. So,
Which is funny to me because you've been in North Dakota long enough to know that this always happens.
well, yeah, and I grew up in Minnesota too, so it's not much different from being there. Yeah, and so like people are out skiing today, which is great. Um, so essentially, I want to pull uh, our city ID, which is what the API said it needs, and our city ID, Bismarck, North Dakota, is 724. And we'll go back to the world weather information page. And I'm going to copy this URL, paste it in, but instead of just a generic city ID, I'm going to put 824, which is Bismarck, North Dakota's city ID. And you can see it came back with a JSON request, and it gave us all of the information for our city. This is a little different from oh no, that's not North Dakota at all. That's San Angelo, Texas. All right. So we have to go back, and I grabbed the wrong city. 724.
You wish we were in San Angelo, Texas right now.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it'd be a little warmer. But that's just fine, because if it was warmer, I'd want to be outside and not doing this podcast. So I'm glad that we're able to get some people started with habitat development today. So we've got a city, that's Bismarck, North Dakota. It gives us information. This is different from the National Weather Service's information report. This is a lot more organized, and there's not quite as much information that comes through here. So that might be a little bit different. I'll chat with Brian and see what he thinks about that. Maybe we can integrate world weather into his, or just make it a separate driver entirely for people around the world. Because I know that a few users from Australia might have an interest in this as well, and I don't want to leave anybody out. So let's see. It gives us
Wing in chat says, drove across the U.S. from Detroit to Vancouver. Vividly remember driving into Bismarck. Was like a perfect stop, time to stop, like an oasis. If you're driving through, the long way across the country at that level, it pretty much is, because there's not a whole lot between Fargo and Bismarck. There's a lot of smaller towns in between there, so I totally understand that sentiment.
Yeah,
and then there probably wasn't much in when you got into Montana.
No, Montana, yeah, until you hit Billings, it's pretty empty. It's something else living in Bismarck, because my parents on their first visit came through and they said, wow, after you get through Fargo, there's really nothing there. Yeah, Bismarck kind of is an oasis. And if anybody actually ends up coming through Bismarck, shoot me a message on the community, and it might be fun to meet up for coffee or something and see a little bit of the city. So let's get this integration written. We've got our JSON URL. I'm basically just going to pull information from this, and we're going to start with our driver. So I'm going to make a new driver. We'll save the changes that we had made there. We'll go back to drivers. I'm going to use this driver that we just wrote, but I'm going to change it. So we'll call it weather device. We'll call it world weather development. And we'll just leave the capabilities for now, because basically I want to try getting information through first, logging that, and then see how we can work with that information that comes out of it. So for weather, I can tell you right now, though, that we will not need on, off, or toggle, but we will need a parse method. So I'm going to take out switch. We'll take a look at our capabilities. Okay, so there, we don't need to declare a capability for parse. We can just write it in. So we're going to parse. Oh, better define that. We're going to parse text. And this will basically take the text, convert it to a string, push it through to the logs. So I think that the most important thing we could put right now would probably be temperature. And let's go back to that capabilities list. We'll take a look at temperature and see what
Can
we
you
have.
just briefly for everybody take a look at what all the different capabilities are, and then maybe give a couple of example of what the other capabilities other than temperature would be good for?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll go through it. I actually have it pulled up, so that's good timing. We have different capabilities here. So a good one would be color temperature. So for this light that's behind me, right now you can see that it's at about 3,000 degrees Kelvin, 300 Kelvin. And if you wanted to make it like into a daylight, you'd want to call a color temperature, and you'd want to say, I want to push this to 5,000 Kelvin. And if you wanted to change the color of it, then you'd want to use the actual color control for it. Or color mode will tell the device, hey, I'm in color temperature mode, or I'm in RGB mode, because for most devices, you can't do both at the same time. There are obviously exceptions to that, but that's an important one to define. So if you've got a contact sensor, then you'd want to mark contact sensor. Or if you have a door that can tell you when it's open, when it's closed, you'd want to enable door control, because you'd want to use contact sensor, and then if you can also control that door. So for example, at threefold, we have an automatic door that you can open and close. You'd want to also apply door control. So you can look through and see which, like for a garage door, you'd want to be able to set that to open and control, or open and close. But there's a ton of different capabilities that you can apply to your different devices. So basically looking through this and saying, here's which ones I need. You can click on them, get the information that you need. So for like a sprinkler,
So you definitely don't want to import the whole thing. You just want to pick and choose the information you want.
Correct. Yep. You definitely just want
Are
to
there any
use
downsides to just building an app template that just grabs everything and then working off of that? Will that bog things down? Or is it more or less just keeping your code clean that you don't want to grab everything?
I don't know how much it'll bog things down. I can certainly tell you it is not going to make it any faster. But as far as listing those capabilities goes, every time you have an app that says, select these switches, and if you have a device that you've then obviously just thrown in every capability for, it'll always show that device. And then you have to handle the switches methods, so on or off. So if you say that your device has the capability switch, when in reality, like, it's a contact sensor, and you try and call to turn that switch on or off, it'll throw an error, and it might stop the rest of the routine from running if you don't handle that exception correctly. So that's not ideal. You don't want to use capabilities that you haven't programmed functionality in for, just because it can lead to unexpected results, and it's certainly not going to help your performance if you're declaring methods that you don't have set up in your device itself. So I would only declare the ones that you are going to handle, and go from there. So in this current example, we have actuator, which you could probably get rid of because we can't actually do anything with it. We have initialize and refresh, and we might need actuator actually. I want to check out the documentation on that, because I remember playing with this back in the day, and I just included by default capability actuator. We're going to keep it in. We'll do a little A/B testing and see what happens.
Would you mind switching back to your desktop input?
Oh yeah, there we go. Thanks, Tony.
Yep.
That's why I need you here. So we've got our actuator, initialize and refresh, and then we'll want to go back to our capability list, and I want to see what we have for temperature. So we have temperature measurement, which is just a number, so that's perfect. So in our case, capability, temperature measurement, which I better double check the case on. So capital T, capital M. We'll save. All right. So we're going to parse our text And now, as you can see, we've got a refresh. And actually, I should have handled this in the other drive we wrote, but I did not. So I'm going to add in refresh. And our refresh method is going to pull that URL from world weather, and it's going to push, or it's going to do an HTTP GET request to try and get information from this. So I'm just going to comment that line in there. I'm going to say log.debug, refresh was call. Boy, I sure hope everybody's having a great Saturday out there. I'm really glad that we can all come together during this time and learn how to program together, and everybody can watch me make a fool of myself as I forget to program in certain syntaxes. So the method that I'm going to use to get this information is called HTTP GET, and we can find that in, there we go, the Hubitat documentation. So for more technical things, I like to go to the Hubitat documentation, or just simply Google search Hubitat documentation and see what the forum has. Usually Chuck Schwer does a really great job of documenting these, and Mike and Bruce do as well, and putting these onto the forum and showing people exactly how different methods operate. So you can see this signature here for HTTP GET. We have a string URI and then a closure. So it'll call this, and then it'll call a closure statement. And what we want to actually do is use the second one, which is a map parameters, and it declares those parameters down below here. So I can see that it says we have a map with a URI, and that's the full URI to send the request to. And then you have more technical settings down here. I'm going to not use those right now. I'm just going to do HTTP GET, our URI with our parameters, and then I'm going to call our device closure. So we'll go back to our driver, HTTP GET, URI, and then take this, put it as a string. So if we were to do a different city lookup, we'd want to change this part in the string, the city identification, to be a different city. And at that point, we do a lookup to say, which city do you live in, and then pull that from the world weather information database. So we're going to have that as our URI. We're going to call parse from there. And, oh, I better close this map. So I can tell you from experience that when we run this, it should actually crash. And we should see an error thrown into the logs. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to go to our devices, and we're going to make a new weather device. And world weather development. I'm going to call it world weather test. All right. So we'll go, I'm going to clear the logs. Oh, it threw an error already. Close this tab. Oh, there we go. All right, no signature of method is applicable for the linked hash map and then a string. And what I'm actually going to have to do is call the text parser, I believe. So there are two things that I'm going to need to do. One is I'm going to say text parser true. Oh, I should put that inside of our map though. Text parser true. And then I'm going to say that which one doesn't it like here? It should call a string as our closure. Maybe I do need to call that with this. Maybe that's what it doesn't like. Let's try it. I'm not sure. Boy, I feel like a fool if that's what it's been this whole time, though. Oh, yeah, that's what it was. Perfect.
And we discussed this a little bit before we decided to do this. This is a lot less plan, and this is you actually coding on the fly, isn't it? Like you don't have the answers to all of this right at your fingertips like the other section, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the other two sections, I've just, I've written a fair number of apps and drivers just throughout my home automation experience, everywhere from smart things to uh, Home Assistant to now being on Hubitat, where just from memory and experience, I can write those out and spin those up. So, um, yeah, this is 100% real. I have done a little bit of homework on this, but essentially I'm doing this from the ground up and doing all the footwork here. And then I also had a little bit of a change as I was expecting to do weather.gov, which is an API that I'm a little more familiar with, but now we have a change since Brian's already been working on that driver, and I don't want to steal that away from him. So yeah, this is 100%, or not 100%, but mostly unplanned. So this is just kind of going through the development and debug process as we work through it. So basically, I'm going to get us that it pulls a temperature, and then that'll probably be the end of the tutorial, and we'll work through it till we can get to there. So right now it's saying it can't invoke method call on null object. That's line 36. I'm going to get rid of toggle here because I'm going to keep hitting that by accident. Okay. So it's calling that. It's saying call parse data. I'll say text. It might be looking for some information. I'm going to refresh this. Hit refresh. Go to our logs. Cannot invoke method call on null object. Line 35, refresh. So something that I like to do in this case is actually just see what the documentation says. So I'll try and find a working example of it. So I'll Hubitat HTTP get. You can see I've Googled this before. So this is actually the page we're on now, and I have this in another app, and I could just go from there. Look at this, Royski. What a guy. Maybe this has what we need. So we're going to look through the code. So it's trying HTTP GET. It's looking for a response. And if it's successful, so we could probably call this, I could certainly do it that way. But I wonder if any other examples are out there just showing how to use that parameter properly. So we're looking to use that. Oops, there we go. Second parameter running. And changes the HTTP GET. So I'm just trying to find where it says that. Okay, so he's Cobra's doing it the same way, which makes sense. Params. Okay. So we might actually just change this. I have a working example on my other hub, and maybe we could just pull that from. So I'm going to go to 10.0.0.11, which is my other hub running at home. And this is the hub that everything in my house actually runs off of. So this is all very real information. And we'll see if I have any drivers that, look, there's a lot of drivers that use HTTP GET. Let's see. You know, I might not actually, I suppose this uses GET or POST. Rootin' Tootin' uses HTTP POST, so we might be able to go into there and just pull that example. Actually, that's a better idea. Alright, so I know I have an example in Rootin' Tootin', and I'm going to pull just the code from here. So it's using HTTP POST, parameters, and reboot, do reboot. Okay. So this is a little different. So maybe we have to call that as a string itself. which would make sense. So we'd want to be calling parse. We'll try that. Go and hit refresh. No signature method. HTTP get is applicable for the
And
argument
Adam, a little reminder for you to zoom in when you're on those other screens there looking at code,
Yeah,
just so
good
that they
call.
can see what you're looking at.
I should just change my screen resolution for future episodes. I'll do that. Thank you again for pointing that out, everybody out there. So, argument type, string, string. So I'm going to go back. I know I'm just doing something that is super simply wrong.
What's so wrong about it?
So essentially you have HTTP get, and right now I've got
Which
my...
get is deprecated at this point, right?
HTTP
You're
get...
not supposed to use get anymore.
You can use get. You
Okay.
probably shouldn't use it for... well, you never should have used it for super secure, where you need to pass things through a URL, but I don't... You can certainly still use it. Basically, the trouble that I'm coming into here is calling this closure method, and I'm trying to figure out how to handle the successful HTTP response. So I'm going to go back to Google. I'm going to see where we have it here. So my function success. All right, so let's see. HTTP get string URL closure anytime. So def my function success. Let's just try this. It's been a while since I've done this. So I'm gonna push that as I'll just take this out. URI equals your URL. Maybe that's why, is that it didn't have a parameter passed through to it, but I'm not sure. All right, so I'm going to declare this as a blank value by default and just see what happens. I'm going to go up here, say command, and I'm going to use this. I think it was called, oh no, it's called my function. And we'll see what happens when we call that. So we got to go back, refresh. I'm going to clear our logs. I'm going to hit my function. Looks like we're doing the same thing here, yep. All right, so I'm throwing some, having some issues there, but I remember the way that Cobra and Royski had written it. So we're actually going to call it a little bit differently. And I'm going to call it as HTTP get, and then I'm going to say that afterwards we're just going to declare our own function response log.debug, which I'm actually going to break for a new line here. Log.debug. Response.data.text is what I think it should be. We're going to have to call that as a string. Close that off. Yeah, and then we're closing that method. No, we're not. Oh, because we have to close the HTTP GET parameters. There we go. So I've saved that. I'm going to go delete my function, which we were just using for testing. I'm going to refresh this, clear our logs, and hit refresh, see what happens. So we called refresh, and it passed through something, it looks like, which is good. So then it's a question of what happened and what went wrong. And sometimes it takes a second for that to come through. So let's push this to our side here. Our Tiger King memes there, of course, being very fun and appropriate for this day and age. If you haven't seen Tiger King yet, it's what a ride. What do you think about it, Tony?
You know what I think about it. It's been it took up a day of the quarantine for me.
Yep. We got a message from Tony. It was like 9 a.m., 10 a.m. and said, hey, you should watch Tiger King. And he said, oh, all right, watch episode 1. And then
Yeah, I just kind of, your wife said to watch it, and I was like, well, you know what? I got nothing better to do. It's on Netflix. It looks kind of silly, but okay, fine.
Yep.
And boy, I was hooked in the first episode, and I just sent back, this is my
life now. If anybody knows what Carol Baskins did, please reach out to your local law enforcement officer and tell them. Let's see. So it's getting response, but I want response dot data. Let's see what it says. So we'll go and hit refresh. Whoops. All right. So yeah, that's the data that it is passing through. It's giving us exactly what we were calling for there. And now I need to parse this request essentially. See, I wonder what happens if we try and log data.city. Data.city. Let's try that. Because it looks like it's actually parsing the JSON information already. So let's just try and hit refresh. Yeah, awesome. So now we can do city.city name. And that should give us a response of Bismarck. Look at that. Wow. It's all coming together. Look at that. We've just spent so much time struggling. And the answer was very simple. So this is essentially all the data that we can pull from here. And we can then go in and say forecast. Currently forecast date 2020 April 4th, which is current, that's our day. Our max temp Fahrenheit. We don't have a minimum temperature Fahrenheit, which I wonder if that just means that it's going to be 0 degrees. So we'll take max temperature Fahrenheit, push that through to our I want to see what temperatures we have here. So it's giving us mins and maxes for every day. And it doesn't look like we have anything that says current. So we're going to push our maximum temperature today. And I'm actually going to push that through to our device temperature. I will pass that through. And I will say temperature measurement. We're going to have to send event. And obviously, send event and name, temperature measurement, value will be response dot data dot city dot. I think that's. We better check the encoding form here just to see how that's all laid out. City name Bismarck, so it looks like that is, so here's a separate section. So forecast dot forecast day. So here's one for forecast dot forecast date. So we can actually just hard code this in forecast dot forecast day dot max temp. Okay. And that should give us the information that we need. So city dot forecast day dot max temp. If it's not already pushed through as a number, we want to convert it into an integer. So basically I'm just doing that to save the data here. I'm going to close this. There we go. So we can get this full screen. Send that event. We hit save, and we'll see what happens. If it pushes through, we should see current state, but it looks like we had an error. And of course, we can't convert a null value, so we better see where we went wrong here. So I'm just going to go one step of the tree through that JSON data at a time. So I'm going to see if we can go data.city, because that would tell us where we went wrong. So we'll hit refresh. There is no, oh no, there is data.city. So we want data.city.forecast day. We'll hit save. We will hit refresh. We'll see what it gives us. So it gives us forecast date. So then we want to get essentially this max temp Fahrenheit. And I might have just, oh, you know what? Yeah, I wonder if I just typed that in wrong there with max temp. I'll hit refresh. It's giving us each max temperature. Today's max temperature is, we can scroll down here, 43. So that would be the first value in our array. So we can say max temp Fahrenheit 0. So that's actually nice. It gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it gives us an entire week of max temperatures, which is that's pretty nice. That can be pretty useful for forecasting information out.
Do you have to do any kind of special parsing to just grab the one of them?
So that's what you see here, where I'm grabbing max temp Fahrenheit for today. And obviously I'd want to take a closer look at how this data is all formatted to get a cleaner response. But essentially I'm just taking the value here and converting it to an integer from that very first value, which we know is today's weather. So we'll hit refresh. Look at that, temperature measurement came through. That's 42 degrees. That's exactly what we were looking for. So that is, I would consider that a success. I mean, it's just a super simple test of what you can do with a weather driver. But again, all we did was take that very basic driver that we had written and we push it forward into something where it actually goes out. It pulls data back from the internet and then it turns it into something useful. And the nice part is that this API, since it's run internationally, should always be consistent. I mean, I presume if I were to go to like an aviation database and look at METARs or look at TAFs, it would show us that information pulled from this on an international database. So it should be very consistent. Hopefully this one lasts us a long time. But Tony, do we have any questions out there before we wrap up today?
Nothing really as far as questions go. We did have something from Brian who posted a few things, but just formatting of it didn't work.
Yeah, no, that's totally. It's good to get more specific with which type of response content you have, and that's a good call. That you can use different data formats, and that's also, you can see a list of those. There's a list somewhere in the Hubitat documentation. I'm not sure if that is in the forums itself or if that is if that's in the documentation. So yeah, does anybody else have any other questions for us today? I would be happy to answer them and to take a deeper look at them. And basically today we kept it simple. We made a basic driver, we made a basic app, we took that and turned it into something more detailed, and it will help people hopefully get started with writing their own drivers and devices. So, yeah, I mean, if there's nothing else, I'm gonna wrap it up here. But I'd like to sincerely thank everybody who tuned in today. If you want to be notified of future events, hit the subscribe button, and otherwise I'll keep posting them to the community forums. I'll upload this stream in its entirety after we're done here today, and I might possibly chunk it up into different sections and post an example video of writing a driver from scratch or writing an app from scratch, or I might go back and re-record those. I'm not entirely sure yet. So if there's no other questions, I'm going to wrap it up. I'd like to thank again everybody for tuning in today. Tony, thank you so much for your help with posting questions, and thanks to our audience today for wrapping. Oh, we actually have a question coming in here, so that's sweet. Stephen S. asks, for the app, how do you let it trigger from other devices? I.e., could it be a switch or a contact? Yeah, that's a great question. So let's actually go back into our demo app, and we can go over that quickly. So let's see. We've got our apps code. I'm going to close these other tabs. I'm going to go into our primer app, and under our inputs where we have a trigger switch, let's say we want to have a trigger contact sensor. I just know this one from experience. You asked if it could be a switch or a contact, so that's what I'm going to do here. So trigger contact, we're going to change it and call it something differently here. I'm going to put it up on our screen, of course. And our contact, our capability here will be contact. Which contact sensor? So for this, I'm going to have it set to, we'll only allow one contact sensor for now. But essentially, we're just doing the exact same thing. You know, we've got trigger contact up here, and we're going to go down and subscribe to that event. So subscribe, settings, trigger contact. That's going to be a contact event, and we're going to call, since we're getting more specifically now, I'm going to change our event handler to be a switch handler, and that'll only handle the switch events. And then for our contact, I'm going to create a new handler called contact handler, and we're going to call that one down here. So def contact handler. We're going to use the same parameters as last time, and actually we're going to take, I'm just going to copy and paste this code because it's super reusable. Log.debug contact is turned event.value, and that should be open or close. And Hubitat capabilities, we have the page loaded up here. We're going to go capabilities. Oops. There we go. Developer documentation capabilities page. That's the method, and I want the capabilities list. So again, I always have to go back through and find those, but I just want to look at the contact sensor. So it's actually contact sensor. Good thing I checked, because that would have been pretty funny to have it throw an error. So it's capability dot contact sensor. It'll give us closed. That's closed with a D, and open, which is just open, not opened. We're going to go through here, and if it opened, we're going to say for device in our settings, turn it on, and then for device in our settings, turn it off, if else, which in this case would be closed. So it'll log that it's either open or closed, and then it'll, if it's open, turn it on, if it's closed, turn it off. And since I had it wrong up here, we have to go through and call it capability.contactSensor instead of contact. So we'll save this. I'm going to go and open my devices. I'm going to have to make a new device. I'm going to make this one a contact sensor. I'm going to call it virtual contact sensor. And there we have it. So right now it's closed. We'll go to our app. We'll see the changes that we've made. And now you can see that we've got a contact sensor option. And it'll let us pick the one that we just made. So I'm going to select that. And you can see that right now both of these are actually required. In a real app where people would be selecting one or the other, you'd want to verify programmatically that one of them is selected, at least one of them is selected, but you wouldn't want to mark them as required, or you'd want to change that if they are required to, if one is selected, then you obviously don't need the other one to be required. So you'd have to programmatically go through and just verify that. So right now I've got a contact sensor selected. I'm going to hit done. And we should be able to go to our contact sensor now and hit open, and we'll see it live here. Hopefully, I hit open and the light turned on. I hit close, the light turned off. So that's, again, it's the exact same principle, just going to that capabilities list and saying if the capability changes to one of these preset values, or to, you know, if we're checking a number, say the temperature is above this value or below this value, or if it's this luminosity outside, I want to change it, you can go through and modify that to be more programmatic. So yes, this would allow you to switch or use a switch or a contact sensor. That's exactly right, Stephen. Nailed it. Yep. So you could, again, go through and change this to use any other capability in this list. If you wanted to, say, use like a button, so I think it's pushable button. Oops, I don't want to print it. I guess I could print it. That'd be a good resource to have. But there's a pushable button command. So you could subscribe to this, and then every time the button is pushed, you could say, run this command. So then you could say, well, run that toggle command that we had written in our driver earlier, or you could call something else. So for example, for the Enterwave button controller driver that I've got written, you can take a look at that in my GitHub repository, but you can use that, and you can actually see that it'll call for a push event, and then it'll run a trigger to turn on or turn off a device if you use it with a different app. But that's basically, you can use any driver or documentation, or excuse me, any capability, and change your result based off of that, going through the list. I'm not seeing any other questions in our chat log here. Tony, I had the screen up for changing that, right?
Yep.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, then we'll just hang on for a sec here and see what questions other people have. If nobody else has anything, then we'll call it for the day and we can get on with it. But that's basically writing an app, writing some minor integrations for the world weather, and moving on from there. It's yeah, Tony, do you have any other questions that you think should be answered right now? Anything that's worthwhile?
Unfortunately, Adam, a lot of this was over my head. I understood the basics of it, but I'll have to re-dig into this once I've gotten a chance to get a hold of my own Hubitat at home. So.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I suppose that so Tony, you're not actually at home right now. I see that Brian Springer had a question. So let's go through and see what Brian has pulled up here. I'm going to take a look. Brian, I'm not seeing your question. I had seen that you had asked, it was just clarification on the code from earlier for the child setup function where I'd actually labeled it incorrectly. I'd say the answer to that question would be just look over your code, you know, and make sure that you are writing things correctly, because that was simply, I made a mistake on my end, and that, well, led to a few problems. So making sure that you're writing things correctly is pretty important as far as syntax goes. Yeah. Well, that's about 2 hours here of live streaming. If nobody else has any questions, then we can call it from there. But yeah, Tony, what do you think?
He asked, could the driver refresh regularly?
Oh, I didn't see that. Yeah, yeah. So that gets into scheduling. Thank you. I didn't see that earlier. Um, could the driver refresh regularly? Yes. Hubitat has a really nice method called run every however many minutes. So if you wanted to, in your driver, go to primary
And
device.
make sure that you switch up your
Thanks,
laptop as the
Tony.
input.
I sure appreciate you doing that. I should, we'll get something figured out for that. But under our initialize method, we could say run every 5 minutes. So this is actually a method that's built into Hubitat. There's a few different methods like it. If you don't want to use cron scheduling, that is, which can get a little bit more. We'll pull out the SmartThings documentation for this because they're both pretty much the same. But there is scheduling where you can select a different run every blank minutes. There's a list of that right here. So you have run every 1 minute, run every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15, 30, 1 hour, or 3 hours. That's if you don't want to use cron scheduling, which can get a little bit more tricky. So for this, you just say, hey, when you initialize this device, so every time the hub boots up, it'll run the device's initialize routine. You could say run every 5 minutes, refresh, and then it would refresh every 5 minutes. And of course, you could change this value to be 1, 15, 10. Of course, if you're doing 1 minute, you have to change it to run every 1 minute. Or if you wanted to run a schedule, you could change that up. So it's pretty simple to actually get everything to refresh every now and then, but that would be probably the easiest way to do it. Yeah, so that should take care of the refresh question. But yeah, Stephen, do you have any other questions? Brian, anybody else out there who would like to have anything more specific answered? I can make sure to get to that here. We are live again from our library. You can see the piano behind me, which unfortunately I don't know how to play anymore. Once upon a time I did, but let's see. I think that should about cover it. So for our viewers out there, thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate all of the questions today, being able to work through some of this just on a Saturday, being able to go through it. Again, we'll post the code to GitHub. We'll make sure that there's examples and documentation out there. And thank you for tuning in. I'd like to do this again. So if you have any questions for next time, leave us a note in the Facebook event, or if you came to this from Reddit, or if you came to this from Habitat forums, I'd love to see your questions asked there, and we'll get to it next time. Thank you so much again for tuning in, and we'll see you in the community.